Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Will, if you want to start it, I can jump in when you leave.
Okay, that works for me.
At the very least, I want Will to read his opening statements because they're great.
You actually prepared opening statements?
Wait, we were supposed to do...
I just brought one out like a couple minutes ago.
Yeah.
I want tails.
Yeah, bottoms up.
Yeah.
Is this being recorded, by the way?
Oh no. God, no, please.
All right.
Okay. Okay. I'm pretty much ready.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I come here to present to the audience what I believe is humanity's only choice forward. Too long have we squandered our potential by fighting one another, fearful of our neighbors, and gripped by paranoia. Eyes dart back and forth, terrified some poor desperate soul will steal away what pitiful scrap we have mustered together on this planet. All the while capitalists applaud our misanthropy as patriotic and loving freedom. What does freedom mean to the starving and the homeless? So I propose a system that is not predicated on exploitation, that does not require us to be pitted against our fellow man to secure safety for ourselves, but a system in which each step I take forward eases the steps those behind me must take as well. It is for those reasons I argue in favor of socialism, which to me means nothing more than fulfilling the dreams that liberalism promised us but has yet to realize. My contentions rest thus far. 1. Socialism presents a more efficient model for a resource distribution. Profit motive, in of itself, moves away from the quality of products produced. Because profit necessitates an interest in producing profit and not producing quality, those who can dictate the product being produced instead favor whatever means that they can produce the most amount of money for themselves, and oftentimes this results in a poor quality commodity for those consuming. We can see this through video games to shoes to clothing to houses. A quick question: I know we had a source necessitate, but if I make claims and I have sources otherwise, can I post them now if asked? Okay. Oh. Okay, I'll go poke around for them afterwards if anyone wants them. Second, it increases democracy in all forms. For the first part, it increases democracy of the economy by allowing those who are both producing and consuming the ownership of the means of productions. It allows for us to have a better control over exactly how much resources we create, what products those are, and the exact ways in which they are produced. By allowing the individuals who are producing commodities to also democratize their workplace, it allows to ensure that those workplaces are safe, secure, and desirable. And also democratizes their government. By allowing individuals to have unchecked wealth, they can influence politicians and buy out interest groups to ensure that policy is decided not in favor of the masses, but in favor of few corporate interests. Socialism ultimately realizes the interests of democracy. Finally, socialism offers the only means in which is moral. Capitalism necessitates the exploitation, and all capitalist systems today require the exploitation of either its workers or other countries. If we are to move forward with an ethical system, we must realize the exploitation of the Southern Hemisphere is not only necessarily unethical, but never viable, because eventually we will destroy those same economies that we are reliant upon. If we want any form of an ethical and efficient future, we have to rely on something that is not capitalism, and I propose that to be socialism.
Nice work. Can I go? I don't have much time. 2 minutes, right? All right. Since I haven't actually written a text, I'm gonna have to just say things that I think are gonna clarify the subject of what is even capitalism. Capitalism is not, at least in anarcho-capitalist philosophy, is not what Marxists call capitalism. Is a different concept. In Marxist theory, capitalism started after the feudal age. But for an ANCAP, it started as soon as humans started trading goods. And this is a very old thing that humans do. They trade goods. And it's one of the things that makes Homo sapiens unique compared to Neanderthals. Neanderthals, as far as we have researched and excavated, they were not very keen on trading tools between themselves and other hominids. That being said, capitalism is something as old as the human species as we know. But this is, again, let me reinforce the fact that this is not the same thing as what a Marxist would call capitalism. When an ANCAP is defending capitalism, he's not defending anything else but voluntary trades and associations. So whenever there is no voluntary relationships, there's not something that an ANCAP is going to get behind of. All right, next point. In anarcho-capitalist theory, but which I prefer to call voluntarist theory, value in any purchase or trade is not defined by an equality between the sides. Meaning, if I buy a chair for $100, it doesn't mean that I think the chair is worth $100. It means that the chair is worth less than $100. Sorry, more than $100. And for the guy who's selling the chair, it means that he values more the $100 than the chair. It's an inequation. What exactly is the value of the chair? Nobody thinks about. The only thing that matters is the inequation that's going to lead to a trade. So every trade implies profit in anarcho-capitalist theory. How much time do I have? All right. All this being said, I hope I'm clarifying things because I really don't expect people to know what NCAPs think when they say things like value subjective or trade is capitalism and so on. Something else, the economy is currently measured as a GDP value. GDP is more related to trade than the actual wealth that is accumulated that is not necessarily being traded. In Austrian economics, we don't necessarily think of GDP as the most important parameter for considering a country to be rich or not. So, for example, I live in Brazil and somebody else lives in Argentina. Argentina might have a bigger GDP, but I can assure you that Brazilians have more net. So it's a question, which one is more valuable, the actual things that you can trade that you have accumulated, or trade itself, the volume of trade? I would argue for not the latter. Do I still have time? All right, just one last. Suppose this, if there is no government, and by government I mean state, what is stopping themselves and making for themselves a society that they want to live in? That is the last thing I'm going to say.
UD, do you want to do an rebut or do you want me to?
You want to rebut? I mean, what do you want to rebut?
Posted in pro-socialism.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Go ahead with that.
So I'm going to respond to two things that were mentioned that I think of interest. The first one being the idea of voluntary organization. So you mentioned that if people want to voluntarily organize in a capitalist system, then sure. But if you make it voluntary, if you imply that, because one of the contentions here is private property. That's one of the big differences between narco-socialism and narco-capitalism. And if individuals can voluntarily organize around private property, that means that if the workers then retract their consent voluntarily, that private property no longer belongs to the capitalist who owns it. Because that very organization is a conceptual organization that at the time is voluntary, but once the union or the syndical, whatever you want to call it, decides we don't want to work under you, we no longer consent to your governance, they then necessarily can retract the ownership the capitalist has a claim over it, which effectively doesn't make it private property. It makes it a democratized system. The only thing that makes it private property is enforcement. It's violence capable that capitalists can bring down on the workers. Anything after that becomes simply democracy, in which case you're simply advocating for a mutualist system in which individuals can elect, or even like a socialist system in which individuals can elect a manager of some sorts. That's effectively what you've argued for. And then second, the idea of private property. If you support effectively, you're claiming that capitalism effectively markets, then for a healthy market, it would clearly indicate that private property is not at all efficient. Private property actually clogs up markets by ensuring that some individuals have more of a say over the markets than others, because it allows some individuals to collectivize huge amounts of power and also dictate production outside of the interests of the masses. We can see this with England, with newspapers and with production of shoes, as I mentioned before, where the interest of profit for certain individuals supersedes the interests of many. Markets are necessarily democratic. That's why they're useful. And if we can collectivize those markets, it allows producers to then who own the means of production to dictate how the production goes, because they also act as consumers. I want to ask if I'm making sense. I don't want to start ranting and no one follows along with my argument. I want to make sure that my audience understands.
Sure. I get it so far.
Okay. Because as both the producers and the owners and the consumers, they at each step have a decision-making power. It increases the democracy of the market and increases the responsivity of the market. Private property simply clogs up the ability for a market to actually respond to demand. Those are my two contentions regarding the claims you made, that you must sort of secede the idea of private property to have a functional system that you're advocating for.
I also want to attack the idea of capitalism that you set up. You said that, the idea of capitalism as in Marxist theory is arising after feudalism. You said that from an anarcho-capitalist perspective, capitalism is basically as old as human civilization itself, setting up with the idea of, trading tools. Well, if you define, capitalism as just trading things, like moving physical material around between individuals, well, then that would also exist in a socialist society. I'm not for abolishing personal property. I can't speak for Will, but I'm not for abolishing personal property. If in a socialist society you want to trade your PS4, for example, for an Xbox, that's perfectly fine. And under your definition, that would be capitalist, no matter how collectivized the markets are in that given society. So I don't think that you can just simply replace the idea of capitalism with the idea of, just simply trading things or moving material around. That doesn't seem coherent to me.
Okay. Do you want to say something? You are muted.
No,
All right. So I respond now, or what? All right. Okay, so the first thing you said was about unions. You gave me an example of a union that is unable to execute its job as being a democratic entity when the owner or the means of production has an unfair advantage over the workers. I would say that unions are perfectly fine in anarcho-capitalist theory as organizations that naturally happen between workers, and the fact that workers also have a leverage just by leaving the job makes it unnecessary that the unions have to associate themselves with the state, or the unions have to physically steal the property of someone who is considered a non-worker but an evil owner of the means of production. The second point you made, private property itself. Okay, so private property is simply what happens when you start accepting personal property and you don't want to create two systems for the same thing based on its usage. So I have a use for, let's say, a computer, and I use the computer to play games. It's a personal property. But then eventually I start getting interested in something more of the productive nature that I can do with a computer, and I start making an internet company or something using my computer, or whatever tool that is at first not useful, and then I start using it as a means of accumulating capital. So there's not really a distinction. The tool itself can be used for the purpose that's considered capital accumulation. A car can be used for that purpose. I can lend the car to somebody else. So from the perspective of an NCAP, if you already accept personal property, private property goes along with it 100% of the time.
Okay.
I think the last point you made was about old humans, like 10,000 years ago trading, right?
Yeah, my point is that I take fundamental issue with your definition of capitalism because it seems to just entail, moving items about, which is not exactly conducive to a good definition.
So it's not just moving items about. It has the perspective that somebody has to agree to moving that item if that person is the owner of the item. And the owner is defined by the first person, and this is very similar to Marxist theory. The first person to work on that thing becomes the owner. And then ownership stays there until the person either dies or either explicitly gives the intention of not having that thing anymore. So once I have something and somebody takes it from me, it's not trade. It's trade whenever I have something and I voluntarily give it away for something else, or I just give it away. Even if I'm being charitable, it's technically a trade, because I find it more valuable to not have the money and give it to somebody else than have the money. It's technically a trade in cap theory.
So that doesn't answer my question. I understand that it's more than just moving material about, right? Like you have this entire system of ownership that gets, transferred. It's like this metaphysical concept that's attached to, the object, whoever the owner is, and it just gets transferred about. So it's more complicated than just moving a material physically, right? Yes. I understand this, but I don't understand how that's more conducive to a good definition of capitalism.
All right, so try to exemplify what would be a good definition similar to that.
Well, you're already constraining me to be similar to the definition that you gave,
yeah,
which
there's a problem in the definition I gave you. Like, try to say an example that wouldn't have that problem, for example.
Do you want me to give an example that proves that definition wrong, or do you want me to give a new definition?
For example, it could be property as a concept that rises from me using that thing and while I use it. So after I stop using it, I don't own it anymore, which is not, it's property, it's similar. Maybe it's something that you agree with.
No, I'm not trying to attack the idea of ownership, although we will get there eventually. I think there are problems with how you define ownership as well. But what right now I'm trying to figure out is why you define capitalism. To me, it seems very arbitrary. You're just saying, oh, well, if you give an item, like I'm saying at a very high level, if you just give an item to someone else, right, meaning that you transfer some metaphysical property, like ownership, to that person, right? Mm-hmm. Now that's capitalism all of a sudden. Right. I don't understand how you arrive at that conclusion.
I can use the word capitalist, but I don't necessarily have to insist on using it. I can use another word, but the concept stays there. I could use. But
I understand this, but like when the broader society references capitalism, they're not talking about what you're talking about. That's the point that I'm trying to make here, and the reason for that is because. The reason for that, why your example fails, is because this whole transfer of ownership is like completely independent of whatever, you know, broader economic system is in the country at that moment. The country can be the USSR, and if you're just, for example, trading like a piece of paper for, you know, a scroll of papyrus, for example, that under your definition would count as capitalism, even though it's just,
yes,
it doesn't really make sense.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So it's not the same. That's why it might be confusing at first. It might even initiate a discussion that is not necessary. But that's why I said that the definition itself is different. An NCAP doesn't define capitalism the same way as a Marxist. It's as simple as that. In the Soviet Union, there is capitalism.
I think
no doubt.
I think that you know, trading market thing that you're describing leads to these inequalities where wealth accumulates in one party over another. And that wealth accumulation then leads to a class of people who have more wealth than another person. And we saw this happen in the USSR in the second economy, because the USSR made alcohol sales illegal because a lot of people were getting drunk and the production wasn't so great. So they made it illegal. Then a secondary market came about with the alcohol sales. The money wasn't going into the economy. And it's because of that second economy that ended up being capitalist that the whole economy of Russia failed. So my point with bringing up that example is to show that simply this trading that happens back and forth will necessarily converge into a system like the capitalism most people are used to talking about, where there's someone who has more wealth and power who's deciding things, and there's another set of people who have to sell their labor as a commodity.
All right, I understood that perfectly. Look, I assume this, I'm a capitalist in the Marxist sense, in the worst sense of the Marxist definition. If I start accumulating money and then I start using that money to basically commit crimes, like like basically stealing from people one way or another, like a mafia, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be a case of capitalism being bad, and that's one of the reasons capitalism is understood as bad. But that can only happen if there is no retribution for the action that initiates force, like absolutely no retribution. There's a book called The Not So Wild Wild West that exemplifies this in many cases, where you'd think that in a society where there is no state, which was the Wild West in the U.S. during the gold rush and before, you would assume that there would be some great discrepancies between people's wealth, and that would create basically local mafias that would be effectively all the time stealing from people. But that didn't happen. Violence was very low during the gold rush.
But in the gold rush, were there people that had more wealth than other people, and then were those people exploiting other people to make more wealth?
Yeah, because the first people who got there are the ones who made most money, and then eventually people just kept coming, and they most of them settled there anyway, even though they didn't find any gold. And you could say that the people who got there first became owners of some means of production, and then the people who got there later were more desperate or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, the first people probably got the best property too, that would have the best like farming yields and other things like that.
I assume that if a Marxist is voting for a candidate that, for example, is defending very insistently the ownership of firearms, including even automatic firearms, I think that this Marxist is doing a good thing. I see him as a friend with his voting power, even though he might be expecting that some revolution is going to happen. I think that just by people having guns, whatever evil, whatever evil could come from the rich classes that accumulate wealth is going to be very, very less evident.
Well, hang on, right?
Go ahead.
So I think you've touched on something. Like you keep hitting on this concept, right? That how do I phrase it? Like you keep saying things like, "Oh yeah, if you have guns, there's nothing to worry about with the rich," or like out in the West, you know, all of these people are there was no like exploitation or whatever, right? The problem is, right, that I don't understand how you can reconcile the fact that you're like supposedly an anarchist, right? So you want to minimize the state, right? Governance, right? But at the same time, you want to have absolute private property, right? You need a state to like enforce private property. You understand this, right?
No.
Because without a state, or okay, well, explain to me how private property can exist without.
Well, just have a gun. I can have a house. I can have a factory. I have enough guns to protect it, can't I?
Yeah, no, but that doesn't legitimize private property in any way. That's just might makes right. Because if someone has more guns, no, but if someone has more guns, you realize that your right to private property immediately dissipates. It's like it's gone. It's in thin air, right?
Yeah, but look at Soviet Union and the U.S. They both had guns enough to create the MAD policy, which is Mutual Assurance Destruction Policy, and there was no war. Just because they were both armed. I agree. If you have the same opinion as me, I would say that the U.S. would have invaded the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union didn't have nuclear weapons. No doubt, absolutely 100%, and vice versa. But when they are both armed, the chances of that happening is much lower.
Hang on. All right, nuclear destruction is a completely different issue than being armed, okay? Countries have been armed for literally this is like undeniable. Humans have been making tools like basically since the modern human was around 200,000 years ago. So by that definition, tribes and, you know, collectives of people have been armed for nearly 200,000 years. And just because they were armed, I mean, you can look in any history textbook, that didn't stop massive wars or conflicts from happening. The thing with MAD, right, is that the potential destruction is so large that it disincentivizes any kind of fighting, because as soon as you start a fight, you immediately just completely desecrate the battlefield, right? That's not true if you're just having, like, for example, I don't know, some kind of assault rifle, right? Like, you understand that these are fundamentally different things, unless you are advocating for the personal ownership of nuclear weapons, in which case developing nuclear weapons takes billions of dollars. So only a very few select like number of people would have them.
No, I'm not advocating for people owning and or creating ICBMs. But what I'm saying is that the motive for no war in the case of the Cold War was no actual nuclear conflict took place, because the people who make the decisions, the people who actually control the ICBMs, they were themselves in the target of the other side, as targets of the other side. So before nuclear weapons, a politician would make a decision in Washington, and some poor fox and soldiers would be sent to Europe, and they would die. Not necessarily the politician in Washington would have any consequence done to him at all. So that's a difference. When you can isolate yourself behind a wall of soldiers and you control those soldiers, it's basically having a gun, but not necessarily being aimed at by anybody else.
No, this is wrong for multiple reasons, right? Like, you can just hire, like, do you really think that, like, if we went ANCAP tomorrow, Jeff Bezos would personally have an M60? No, obviously not. He would just hire a bunch of like a private military, like mercenaries, who are probably a lot more fit and a lot more combat trained than he is. It just makes the most sense, right? And yes, I understand to an extent politicians make decisions like that because they're isolated from the consequences of their actions. But if we extend that to MAD, well, politicians will always be isolated from, well, not always, but the top brass. The president is not going to be he is going to be affected, but he's not going to die from something like the result of a nuclear fallout or a nuclear war, right? So to an extent, he's also isolated from the consequences of pushing the nuclear button, right? So why don't they do that?
It's not just the president. It's a group of, let's say 100,000. The president doesn't make decisions in isolation.
No, it's not a group of 100,000.
The other people that support Trump right now see that Trump is going to get them in trouble or in danger. Trump is going to disappear. He's not even going to resign. He's going to simply disappear.
So, wait, I'm very confused by this. So, if Trump was like about to get us into something really stupid, like for example, like if there was a disease that started in like some faraway country and it landed in the United States, for example, and it was spreading really, really fast, and Trump was like downplaying it, right? And then it got really, really big. Trump's powers would like suddenly vanish because everyone would realize that Trump's doing a bad job and he's going to get like millions killed. We're going to have to dig mass graves.
No, not millions. Only the politician class. If the politician class is being heard, then they're going to try to stop Trump, no doubt.
Okay, I still don't see what this has to do with your right to private property without a state, right? My argument still holds, right? Going in or like setting an armed task force into your private property with like a bunch of guns is not the same thing as throwing nuclear weapons at each other, okay? The main difference is that the thing that you're fighting over doesn't get completely destroyed in the process. That's the difference, okay? So your right to private property does instantly vanish if someone has more guns than you. Like, it's just might makes right. Whoever has the most guns is just like going to be, the new king. They can establish, their own country.
Those people who would be fighting for Jeff Bezos, though, would be the kind of people that I am. So I think that the ideology of someone on that side who owns property like me, the small person that owns just a little bit, who would be in competition with Jeff Bezos, that army would be made up of mercenaries on the same political level that I'm at. And if I fought hard enough and the other people around me fought hard enough, that would be a way to protect my property because it could inspire other people to fight with me.
So you're arguing that because the soldier is in the same class as a person that they were expected to invade, they would kind of band together around this idea and it's metaphorically turn their rifles on the generals.
Yeah, or just not accept the job to begin with. I think that the bulk of the people who would have their gun and want to protect their own private property would stand up together.
I mean, all right. Well, I could point to a lot of practical, I could point to a lot of examples that are happening in the real world right now. Like, for example, the U.S., right? Yeah. The U.S., unquestionably, the U.S. soldier on the battlefield out in Iraq has more in common, just from a social class point of view with the person that they're shooting at than the person who gave them the orders to shoot at, right? So we don't see this happen. But let's say that it was going to happen, right? That these people are somehow more inclined to, not invade the little guy, right? Well, the other issue is that they don't have to be invading all these little territories. It could just be, two big guys fighting each other, right? And you might say, oh, well, now you're getting around the issue. I think that the strongest argument against this, right, is that you could just incentivize them more, right? There's under this kind of system, there would be no reason to not take economic incentives. So if you just arbitrarily increase the economic incentive to something like Jeff Bezos has $100 billion, right? Mm-hmm. If you offer each of these soldiers, for example, $10 million, that's probably more money than they'll see in their entire life. It's a lot, right? So you can raise the economic incentive high enough.
Yeah, the difference in the Iraq case is that those people in Iraq are not the same as domestic U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens, where each of us have our own gun, that's a different situation. For example, there was this group of militants in Oregon who took over federal property because the government having a monopoly on the federal property is a crime. So when they took this over, the federal government didn't go in there and shoot them or bomb them. They didn't bring in the military. They tried to get them to leave. They let them stay there for a long time. So the way that the American citizens are treated are different than what the American soldiers are doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, you know, as an anarcho-capitalist, I'm against this type of imperialistic behavior. I think that's a crime, just like the same sort of things that can happen in the other industries. But each of the people in the United States protecting their property using their guns, that would be a different situation. So that breaks the symmetry in that analogy. The other thing is with the money case in the soldiers, if Jeff Bezos is paying each of those soldiers a ton of money, but we're in sort of this anarcho system where you're competing with those that have more power than the other, then those soldiers, if they have that much money, they wouldn't need to fight themselves. They could just give them that money to other people. And they could just hire out these other people. So it becomes this infinite regress where it's still putting the burden on the little guy.
All right, sorry, I'm going to
No, I'm just saying it's putting it on the little guy. It's always going to trickle down to paying someone else to do the dirty work, and it's going to bottom out. And then those little guys on the bottom are gonna believe in that same ideas.
Right. So this sounds very similar to like a feudal system, right? Like you have the king, but the nobles under him, and then under the nobles you have the vassals, and under the vassals you have like knights, and under the knights you have like, you know, the serfs, you know, like one or two serfs, you know, they all get their little parcel of land, right? You see how do I say it? Like you can offer the minimum economic, like you can pit people against each other in such a way that it's more, that at least in the short term, it feels more beneficial for them to fight against each other than unify for a joint cause, right? I think that you see this a lot today, right? Like unions and worker cooperatives, right? Like I think worker cooperatives are less likely to fire people if, for example, there's a decrease in revenue for the company. They just cut the salaries, right?
Worker cooperatives these types of things, though.
I mean, yes, but you would agree that.
I mean, that's still exchange of wages and money. There's still the hierarchy of someone who is at the top and can accumulate wealth. Even though the corporation is owned, that person who's in charge of the company, he has a lot more assets and he's getting a bigger paycheck. Even though it's more fair, still capitalist. I am totally for worker-owned co-ops, but that's all working within a capitalist system.
Right, I understand this, but to an extent, it is collectivized because the workers do own the workplace to a large extent, much more than this is why we have the term worker cooperative, distinguishing it from a normal company. Because in a normal company, the structure is far more totalitarian, right? Because the workers don't really, unless they buy stock in the company, they don't really own anything in the company. They don't get to have a say, right? In a worker cooperative, the dynamic is different. While, you know, each individual worker might not have gained that much of a share, collectively, they now have the, you know, kind of bargaining power to actually make decisions in the company, right? So I think that they are fundamentally different situations.
Can I like just ask a really stupid question?
Yeah.
All right. So what's the next point?
Well, Prue, what was your question, Prue?
So, like, if a manager specializes while maintaining means of production, wouldn't he like have a greater ability to like manage things, basically plan things out? Why would like the worker cooperative, which basically specializes on one kind of force because of the division of labor, why would they be responsible for any kind of large-scale plannings, basically?
Well, because there's an accumulation of wealth that happens in the worker co-op. So the person who's in charge, the manager, he's getting paid more money. He can save more of that money, and a smaller percentage of his paycheck is going to pay for these other expenses. So, like the person at the bottom of the worker co-op, who's like running the what is it called? Assembly line or whatever. That person is basically still just making enough to live a comfortable life. The manager is still making enough to live a comfortable life, plus have luxuries, and they can accumulate their wealth, and the capitalist system just converges on and on and on. It doesn't really get rid of the problem.
Yeah, I understand the issue regarding concentration of wealth, but specifically regarding UD's point with worker cooperatives, like having the lower class being able to like plan things out. Like, why do they need to be put in a position where they plan?
Right. My point is that not that inexperienced members, for example, can now make large executive decisions in a company. The point of that I'm trying to make, right? Because obviously, you know, the more experienced you are, and if you have some managerial, experience, you're going to be promoted to being a manager, right? There's always going to be that kind of, someone always has to manage, right? That's always a job that's going to be there. And I'm obviously not like so silly as to argue against the concept of the division of labor, right? So yes, there is always going to be a manager who's making most of like, oh, well, do we invest in this? Do we move this here? But I'm talking about executive, like, for example, decisions that, would generally involve the entire company. Like, for example, firing a person, or, raising or lowering wages, or, having a meet on, productivity. Like, what direction is the company going to go in? Obviously, all the technical stuff that would require, kind of a manager, like, kind of a managerial skill, right? Like, for example, investing, all the micromanaging is going to be managed by the managers, right? I'm talking about the general large, like the big picture stuff. What direction is the company moving in, etc.
Fair enough.
Leopold, you wanted to move on to another point, you said?
I don't know, UD, if you want to ask something else, I can give you some thoughts on co-ops. I would argue this, that right now we have more technology and decisions can be more decentralized. So 100 years from now, you would be able to see many more co-ops. And I would say that even the fact that we have a lot of bureaucracy right now is going to stop this process, but it's not going to stop it completely. If you take a look at the Victorian age in Britain, you would see a lot of co-ops there. It's an age where the Queen herself would advocate for free trade. The Opium Wars were about free trade. So it's the opium traders from Britain were being jailed or persecuted in China. And then the Queen was like, bro, you gotta accept free trade. You cannot attack a trader who is selling something voluntarily, and that's how it happened. After that, England was not more. I don't know. I don't remember if it's Edward's II after Queen Victoria, but I know sure that after her age, the golden age of England, things were never the same. And right now, if you want to open a co-op, you're gonna have to go through a lot of bureaucracy. And I bet this bureaucracy is artificial. It's created in a certain way that you basically cannot have a co-op as easily as you could without it.
All right, so your argument is against bureaucracy, not collectivization.
Yeah, I'd say that free market and no bureaucracy would give you a lot of examples of co-ops that you would look at and
wait, hang on. I immediately have to take issue with that. You're saying that the free market produces more worker co-ops than a system with government regulations.
Yes.
Like, have you heard of the Gilded Age in America, where we specifically had to elect leaders? There was literally people. It's ridiculous, but like, imagine like a campaign, like a candidate coming out in America specifically campaigning, like a major part of their campaign, like, for example, think like Bernie and Medicare for All, like that big of a part of your campaign, and they were just campaigning on like breaking up one company, like Standard Oil or Google or right, like Google or Facebook.
Yeah. Okay.
Back then, that was a thing. People would like campaign to break up Standard Oil.
Yeah.
Like, these were huge things that were, the United States used to bomb striking union workers, right? Like,
no, I'm not aware of that.
it's called the Battle of
Perfectly possible.
But I have a question about the alternative that socialism is presenting, because as it stands right now, the means of production are private property, and that private property that's not something that you can just take away or collectivize. That would be theft. What is your solution where the private property becomes public property and is done so consensually? Because that's undemocratic. And if your position is standing on the platform of greater democracy, you can't begin it with something that is fundamentally undemocratic.
Well, hang on, right? So you're saying that you can't. All right, let me slow down. All right, you, as Marx describes in his material, his dialectic, right? There's a proletariat, right? And there's the antithesis, which is the bourgeoisie, right? Who own the means of production. Right? Two fundamentally different classes, right? And he says, thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis is socialism, right? So what he says is there needs to be some kind of violent confrontation where the proletariat, take the private property from the bourgeoisie. And you're saying, well, isn't that fundamentally undemocratic because you are, ignoring the rights or the vote of the bourgeoisie, who will obviously, most of them anyway.
Well, not only that, but it's theft, and it's done so violently, which is just might makes right, like you said earlier with the anarcho system. So if you're against might makes right and you want it to be democratic, then why are you using might makes right and undemocratic processes to take away something from a certain set of people?
Well, the difference between the might makes right the example that I brought up with Leopold, it was just whoever had more guns. In this example, sorry. In the example with Leopold, right, you could have two completely unrelated parties, right, who are operating completely outside of each other's spheres, never interacted. Then one larger party is informed of the existence of the other party and immediately destroys them and takes their property, okay? That's might makes right. The difference in my case here, the difference is these are two classes which are fundamentally in conflict, right? So the bourgeoisie necessarily have to steal the wage labor of the proletariat, right? So in fact, I would say that the bourgeoisie are constantly in offense on the proletariat. They're constantly stealing from them. And they're stealing from them basically at gunpoint, or not at gunpoint, but like at starvation point, right? Because, well, you might say, well, if they're getting stolen from, why don't they just, leave their job, right? Well, if they leave their job, they starve, right? It's really that simple. It's not might makes right because, the proletariat were offended first.
So it's a vengeance thing.
Well, no, it's not. There's a well, I don't know. It depends on where you draw the line between vengeance and like self-defense.
Yeah, I don't see, but then this is becoming a moral argument, not an economic one. And so then what's the moral argument for the exploitation of the worker being wrong? The economic argument right now is that, okay, well, this stuff happens, and of course, bad things happen. There's also the immoral act of taking the property that's already owned. That itself is also a moral argument.
Why is taking the property? Yeah. Well, that immediately. Well, all right. Well, if you're saying taking the property is immoral one way, then why isn't it immoral the other way, right? Because the wages of the proletariat are also their property, right? So if you don't have to justify if you don't have to justify yourself saying that the proletariat taking the bourgeoisie's property is immoral, then I don't have to justify saying the bourgeoisie taking.
The difference is I don't think that the bourgeoisie making profit in the capitalist system is immoral because the bourgeoisie is taking all the financial risk. If the company fails, I lose my money as a capitalist. If the company fails, the worker can possibly get another job at another company that's competing and doing better and will buy my failure. The worker still has mobility in the market, but I take all the risk, I put everything forward, and if this stuff is gone, I'm totally screwed. And so because I take the risk, I then own the profit that comes out of it. So it's not an exploitation. Saying that I'm exploiting the worker is actually trying to steal something that I own from the beginning, which is the profit. So you have to make a moral argument as to why that equation is wrong.
Go ahead. Oh, never mind.
No, you can go ahead.
Bird also a Marxist, a socialist, or is UDS the only socialist here?
I was trying to think of every time. I'm also trying to do socialist, but I've been trying to.
Oh, okay.
Response.
Right. Okay. So you have to draw a line. So you're saying that one initial investment. So all right. So
yeah, because
you're saying right. I understand. I understand what you're saying. Right. I'm just a little bit, I'm stumbling a little bit, right? So the point that I want to make is that you're saying that any initial investment in a company entitles you to unlimited profits from that company. Right?
No, not
because
unlimited.
that's what you've said. Wait, hang on. Well, okay, then where's the threshold?
The threshold is I make sure that the worker gets paid a living wage that is comfortable, and the surplus value that's there is something that is owed to me because that is worth the risk I took when I invested in the company or the corporation or whatever. So it's more that it's the risk equals the surplus value profit, and I make sure that the laborer is paid for their time.
Okay, well, you said a living wage, which I don't understand why you would have any incentive to do that under an anarcho-capitalist system.
Because I want the worker to keep working.
Okay, well, in slavery, the slaves were actually given free healthcare and actually housing and board. Would you disagree that they're exploited?
But the slave had no freedom there, and that's sort of what makes the symmetry break in the equation. Away. No, the slave could run away. Yeah, the slave would have been shot if it ran away.
Look, if it's an effective slavery system, the slave cannot run away. He's going to work shit out.
I mean, the difference.
Okay, this is fair. This is fair, right? That
I mean, it's sort of going back to the moral argument. Like, slavery is immoral, but wage labor being immoral is a harder case to make, I think.
Right. So the running away thing was a little bit of a meme, but the point that I'm making is that let's say that you had the exact same slavery situation, but instead the slave could. Like if they didn't like it at their current plantation, like their owner was like too mean to them or something, they could like instantly teleport to another plantation, right? Would that make it any better?
Well, no, because there's still the immoral problem of slavery in that analogy.
Okay, so are we disagreeing on whether slavery? Okay.
I mean, I agree slavery is immoral. I don't agree wage labor is immoral. I mean, wage labor happens in the co-op too. It might be a better amount of money, a higher amount of money. I'm for that. Like, I would love to pay people lots of money, but the system as a whole, the capitalist system as a whole, is much better and safer than the socialist one, because if you collectivize all the property, then that necessarily means a strong state, and a strong state will lead to authoritarian and totalitarian actions.
I think I can exemplify this to UDS. Imagine this. Imagine that we're going to call anybody who is an employer a worker, and the owner is not going to be considered a worker. Is going to be considered a parasite. He adds absolutely no value to the company that he owns. Imagine the workers get together and realize this. But instead of simply stealing the means of production from the owner, the workers start another competitive business, and then they simply don't have a parasite to deal with now, and then they can compete against the first company and win because they have less costs. That's the whole argument behind Marxism, in the sense that Marxism is going to be more efficient, because it's going to be more efficient whenever you remove the parasitic class. However, if it was really the case, then I could start a company, a co-op. If it was really the case that the owner is always a parasite, then I could start a co-op and I would simply outcompete everybody.
No, wait, hang on, right? The argument with Marxism is not always that, well, okay, it is more efficient, but the reason why it's more efficient, right? One of the reasons, right? One of the major reasons, I believe, is that you're not making 32 brands of soap, right? It's because you're not wasting additional productivity on products that you've already produced. You're just making like 32 variations of it, like jalapeno flavored soap, and it's like really stupid. that's one of the reasons, right? So that problem wouldn't be removed in that analogy. Another problem is that you're saying you can just leave and start another like a company, right? But that would be considered a form of like kind of like union forming, like kind of starting to collectivize. And there's a lot of union busting that goes around in big corporations. I don't know if you've seen Amazon's introductory video. Like they bake the anti-unionism in there. Like if you see anyone like trying to, you know, collectivize, form a union, you report it to your supervisor. I don't know why. I think they might give a monetary incentive. Don't quote me on that though. And then the other guy gets kicked out, and you know that's how they union bust. They just have a lot of propaganda. So I don't understand this.
No, it's another company. They're gonna unionize. They're gonna leave the company. They're gonna borrow some credit or whatever. They're gonna buy the means of productions, and then they're gonna start another company and outcompete the first one.
Yeah, but how are they gonna buy the means of production?
Because there's credit. Everybody has credit.
Oh, okay. So they all have a lot of money.
You imagine this. It's going to be efficient from the bottom up. I can have credit just by that fact. If I can guarantee that my system is more efficient, I have credit.
Oh, you're talking about bank credit. Oh, well, that's just factually.
Yeah.
Well, that's just factually incorrect. Like banks are statistically less likely to loan to worker cooperatives, even though worker cooperatives are like basically shown in almost every study to be, you know, better performing on many metrics.
Imagine the manager, which is not necessarily the owner, is the one who's starting this. He's more rich. He's richer than the other guys, the other employees, and he has some credit. He could start buying one machine and then 2 machines, 3 machines. Not that expensive. It's a risk. Also, it's a risky thing to do, though.
Also, worker co-ops are capitalists.
Yeah, but look, UDS is not used to the way capitalism is the word capitalism is being used here. You're gonna say it's capitalist is not gonna accept so easily.
No, I accept that worker cooperatives are capitalist. I'm just saying that this is a more democratic system of capitalism. I'm not saying it's the ideal form. What I'm trying to show is kind of like similar to like, I don't want to be cringe, but like proof by induction, right? I'm saying if you step in this direction, it just gets better. If you take another step in this direction, it gets better, right? So maybe we're at trade unions at this point. If you take another step, you get to work cooperatives, and it keeps getting better. I'm trying to show that maybe, right? Like it's obviously not a foolproof argument by any means, but if you keep going and you go to socialism, right? The outcome is better than capitalism. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm not arguing that work cooperatives are socialism.
Okay, but you support unions like they are now, regulated by the state, or not?
I'm gonna say tentatively no. I support unions in general, but I don't think that the legislation we have now regarding them is good. Especially since I've literally, again, referencing the Amazon introductory video, if big corporations can union bust so easily, I don't think that the legislation we have regarding them is adequate.
So do you think that that it's basically just like a long road to a true communism or socialism?
Well, you have to make the distinction between those two, right? Like communism is necessarily a post-scarcity like ideology. So yes, it is a long road to communism, right?
Yeah.
Socialism, maybe it depends. Like you could either go like, you know, a long route of reforms, and then, you know, again, you'd have to somehow like through basically a violent means, you'd have to seize the means of production, right? Or you could just have an immediate violent revolution that cause a lot of political turmoil immediately. So I don't know. It depends on how you define far away for socialism.
So socialism is the middle between the capitalist and the communist, right?
I wouldn't say that. I would put it as the Lenin quote goes, you know, the goal of socialism is communism, right? I would say it's a transition state. It's not an intermediate position between the two. It's more of a transition state from capitalism to communism.
Okay, so in this transition state, it's still capitalist.
Yeah, well, it has a lot of characteristics of capitalism, right? You know, another quote, socialism will be stamped with the birthmarks of capitalism. It will have a lot of capitalistic tendencies, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is, like, it seems to me like socialism is just sort of trying to put band-aids on problems that come up in capitalism, but it's still just capitalism, but with band-aids. Like, for example, UBI. UBI might help out a lot of people, but it's still capitalism. And another thing that comes up is this idea of like progressive taxes, and you increase the wealth at the bottom, and that helps people, but it also will stifle the economy. Like, we can see what Keynesian economics did to the United States economy after World War II. It just, you know, if you agree with Marx, and a lot of capitalist economists do agree that the rate of profit tends to fall over time. As that falls, the economy stagnates. And the only way to get a boom after it is to let all the capital go to zero. And then you can have boom and growth again. So there's this up and down that happens in capitalism. But what we learn with Keynesian economics is if you control the downs so that the downs aren't as bad and all the people on the bottom aren't hurt as much, you actually choke the economy, you stagnate wages so people don't have smaller purchasing power, you increase inflation, and it creates a worse position for people at the bottom than just normal free market economy. So I don't see why we should move to a system like socialism where we're putting band-aids on a system, making it worse for everyone on the bottom, when we can just let the economy crash when it crashes, let it build up and boom again afterwards, let the market do what it's going to do naturally. People will be a lot better off if we just let it happen naturally. The automation will happen naturally, and then we'll get to this post-scarcity world, and we won't need to do any of this weird socialism, collectivized property stuff. Everyone will just get there better in the long run without it.
Well said.
Yeah, there was a lot of things in there. There was one thing that I want to say. Oh yeah, the whole thing with Keynesian economics. Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree, but then I would point you to like the Chicago Boys in Chile, right? Like that was arguably more of a failure, right? And you might say, oh well, Chile was just a smaller country, right? But I mean, this is kind of like a qualitative, feeling it out. You can feel free to call me out. I don't have any data, but I feel like proportional to, GDP and, controlling for population size and all that, neoliberalism was actually a bigger failure in Chile than Keynesian economics ever was in the United States. I would make that argument. But
neoliberalism helped out the United States. Like all the problems in the 2008 financial crash. Yeah, I mean, there are bad things that happen in imperialism, but I'm not necessarily for the imperialistic aspect. I'm for the free market aspect.
Right.
Chile,
do you disagree that
Chile, it's the best, at least economically wise, country in South America here?
Not so sure about that.
Yeah, it is. I can give you my look. It's not perfectly a free market, but it's well above the average.
And there's also this issue of short-term worse, long-term better. So the problem with sort of the Keynesian bent or the progressive taxes, the high inheritance taxes, the wealth taxes to give increased welfare programs, more socialized capitalism. The problem with that type of capitalism is in the short term, it looks like it's better. But in the long term, the income inequality still happens. The wages don't increase at all for the worker. Inflation gets worse. And the economy starts to stagnate. So everyone gets hurt. But at least in the free market system, even though there might be short-term falls that are really bad, like the bottom of a depression or a recession, the bounce back is going to be better. The amount of people who are going to be able to get out of poverty is going to be much worse. Like one thing you talked about was the Gilded Age. So yeah, there were a lot of problems in the Gilded Age, but it was also the one time in the United States where someone who was dirt poor could become as rich as Carnegie Mellon. There hasn't been another time in the United States like that. And that was in the Gilded Age when there weren't any regulations like that. So class mobility is much higher in a time period where there's less regulations than it is when there is sort of this Keynesian thing.
Well, there's also there's also arguments of, well, for that point specifically, right? There's also the argument of saturation. Once you've had, like, you basically need to luck out to become rich, right? In the current system, and even back then, right? Like, if you happened to own land upon which you could, extract oil from, and then you could build more oil rigs and so on and so on, right? Or if you got a lucky investment in, like, let's say, a new developing oil like kerosene, or something like that, right? Yes, sure, you would get extraordinarily rich, and you could, in theory, be dirt poor at the beginning, right? Yeah. But what does that do to the chances for other people, right? Well, in the absence of regulation, what happened to the quality of products, right?
My point is that in the two cases, one of those, there is an opportunity for someone to go from bottom to top, and the other one, that opportunity is gone. So there's no possibility for someone in the modern day to shoot up to a Jeff Bezos coming from dirt poor, but there was that opportunity in the Gilded Age.
Wait, so can you explain why you say the regulations lower economic mobility? I'm curious as to the specifics.
I'm just saying that's what we observe.
I can explain. Look, you can see narco-capitalism as something that allows free associations, right? Simply that. Like, you can completely drop the idea that we are advocating for a strong centralized state. We actually advocate a state supported by companies. We're advocating for the opposite. We're advocating for any kind of free association, including cooperatives or whatever is more efficient. In the case of regulations, what happens when there are regulation is a centralization of power. So this centralized power doesn't care at all if you want to change the rules a bit to solve a problem that is going to get solved. It's going to get solved, but it doesn't care. It's a crime. You're not able to do that. I can give you an example. You can think of an app that is not necessarily owned by one person, but it basically allows people to associate in a certain manner. I don't know. There are apps where you can, like, I'm gonna travel to Chile and I want to leave my dog in care with someone. So I download this app. I go to somebody's page on the app, and then I give him the dog and I pay him. That's an example of an app. It used to be a company with managers and CEOs and maybe even useless parasites at the top. But now it's not anymore because people are able to create this kind of associations. But you take a look at Colombia. Colombia is banning Uber. That's a regulation. A regulation is going to be stiff by definition. It's going to be a decision made by someone that doesn't necessarily knows the consequences or care about the consequences.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Regulations impose limitations on economic transactions, I'd imagine, in general, might end up as the consequence of lowering economic mobility for particular people. So
yeah, sure. You could make this argument, but you gotta also think about the alternative, right? So there are multiple things wrong with this, right? So when you're saying, like, oh yeah, man, that was dirt poor could become as rich as, for example, let's say Vanderbilt, right? Or, like, let's say Rockefeller, right? Let's say Rockefeller and the oil industry, right? Let's say someone was seeing how rich Rockefeller was getting, right? It was near. Well, let's say he was, like, halfway up. He wasn't even near the peak of his power, right? If you tried to start an oil company, then they would just, like, they would cut their prices down to zero and they would bleed money until you went out of business because you just couldn't compete with the prices, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how exactly does that increase economic mobility?
That's in a closed system. You're saying that, like, because I can't open an oil business or because I can't start an Amazon, then because Amazon exists, therefore I have no market mobility. That's not what that's about. What this is about is you can start a company in an industry of your choosing, except for one where there's already a monopoly. In that case, you can argue why monopolies are bad, but the mobility for someone to go from really poor to really rich was higher in a free market system than it is in a Keynesian regulated system.
I think an argument can be made even beyond that. I think there is no monopoly that guarantees Amazon is going to completely outcompete the competition. The competition is going to be existing if they're competent. There's no, they have a share of the market. If they can outcompete even locally, or because there is a share of customers that prefer them besides Amazon, then they're going to still exist. They don't have to be as big as Amazon to exist.
Yeah, they don't have to be as big as Amazon to exist, but there are other alternatives to Amazon, right? They do exist, but if you're going to argue that any of those are real competitors to Amazon, I would say that you're out of your mind, right? Like, even the mere existence of Apple disproves this talking point, right? Like, Apple is not competitive. Wait, hang on. Apple is not competitive on the electronics market, okay? It's just not, right? The main thing that they do is they intentionally break electronics to have you rebuy the new stuff, right? They have all of their electronics linked within one grid, so they don't link with another company's, for example, stuff. And that's how they make all their money. Like, these electronics are not competitive.
Right, I agree with you. I mean, what breaks the symmetry of this analogy is that we don't live in a free market system. Apple is in a regulated system. So is Amazon. Both of those companies are getting subsidies and tax breaks, etc., from the government because they're businesses. They're being supported by the government. So in this case, we're not in a free market system. It's not comparable.
Yeah, then we go back to the original analogy where you are just like this dirt poor person in the Gilded Age. Let's actually use that example, right? Let's say you wanted to start a business in a completely new industry, but to start a business in a new industry, you need to acquire literally, things by which you produce, the means of production. You need to acquire these types of things. Like, by some calculations back then, you would need to work for like 100 years to acquire some kind of just one factory, right? This is crazy. Like, to argue that this implies economic mobility in any sense is insane.
Well, no,
yeah, sure,
I'm
you could get
that...
lucky. You could get lucky on gambling for rich people, which is stocks, right? But other than that, you don't really have any economic mobility.
It's not just implied, it's observed. We can observe the economic mobility in free market systems versus these regulated systems, and we see that the mobility is higher in free market economies. It can come down to empirical evidence, which is what I'm talking about here. And in the case of the regulated system versus the not, we're still arguing over which type of capitalism is better. We're not even talking about if socialism offers an alternative. So from the way I see it, capitalism is still the choice over socialism.
All right, hang on. Clarify what you mean by economic mobility. Do you mean more people move upward on average? Is that?
No, I just mean that you can start from a place of very low capital and get to the highest tier of society much more easily than you could in modern day.
So it's just like a differential of
the range is a lot wider in the free market system for a person than it is in the. Of course, there's competition. It's a zero-sum game at the end of the day, but it's still a zero-sum game in the regulated socialism one too. The only difference is it chokes the profit that's made and the growth that happens, and it stagnates the economy, which hurts everybody.
I'd say it's not even a zero-sum game. I don't think it's.
All right. Well, two things, right? So Leopold is absolutely right. Like, when you start a company or you do when you work on things, it's not a zero-sum game, right? Value is created, not in trades, but by labor, right? That's what I believe. The other thing is, if you're just using economic mobility as can you go from $0 to 200 billion, yeah, sure, that's fine. Just because you're gonna have a few outliers that are gonna extend the range, right? That's fine. I can't argue with you on that. But I don't think that's now. I thought you were talking about the other thing, which is on average more people move up in social class compared to their parents. But this is yeah, sure, that's fine. I'll concede that, yeah, you can go, back in the Gilded Age, you could go from $0 to, Rockefeller, and that was unprecedented. But I don't think that's a very useful indicator of anything at all. Because you can have just one person who has literally all of the money. Right, obviously it doesn't work that way. Right? Because,
how does
value is
somebody
created, but like...
How does somebody start owning a factory? How it goes?
You
How does it
gotta
go?
buy it.
Yeah, but look, the guy owns a factory. How did he own the factory? How did that happen? Did he just steal a factory?
Either he got a loan, he was born into some kind of wealth,
and where
or
did the
he had
wealth,
a high-paying job.
Where did the wealth come from? Did somebody steal the wealth? Or yeah, let's assume
what do you mean? It was
like,
created by people who work on objects, right?
Okay, so you're gonna take the labor theory of value and try to create a factory from that. That's all right. Let's suppose there's no trade, no value created on trade. So I'm working and then I accumulate a certain amount of money or things that are valuable, and then I give it to my son, and then he does the same, and my family starts to accumulate capital, right? And then eventually my grandson is able to buy a factory. Well, what is the problem in that?
Hang on. Buying a factory is in like, that's innately like implying a trade of the product for the factory. What I'm talking about is you have to think about it more fundamentally, right? What I'm saying is, no, value is not created through trade, right? Like if you go back to the Neolithic era and you have like people trading, like, for example, like a stone hatchet for like a stick or something like that, or like firewood. No, that doesn't create value. What I'm saying is, in my like model, right? Like you have the big, like the original person who creates, for example, he figures out how to, create a silicone wafers, right? And then he dies. He passes it on to his son. His son figures out how to, create semiconductors and, dope those semiconductors, and on and on and on and on until you get to, like the great grandson who can now build a supercomputer. I would say value has been created. You've gone from, refining silicon, basically glass blowing, to creating, a supercomputer. I would say values has been created in that kind of example. The same thing does not happen if you assume, trading between civilizations, even for like the first 10,000 years of human civilization even the first, for the first 10,000 years of human civilization, from like the cradle of civilization to, right up until Roman times, I would say not that much value going from basically glass blowing to a supercomputer has not been created, right? The idea is that these people working and creating is what creates the value. It's what creates, it's what creates the value. It's not the idea of the training that creates value.
Imagine a situation where I have a car and my neighbor has a motorcycle, and I can only drive motorcycles and my neighbor can only drive cars. If I trade with him my motorcycle for his car and vice versa, don't you agree it's going to create value? I'm now able to drive a car and is able to drive a motorcycle.
There are 15 more minutes.
Yeah, sure. You created use value for both of you there, right? But my point is that, yeah, sure, you created use value there.
I agree that you can. Just a comment. Since you said work, I agree that work creates value. But all I'm doing is saying that trade is also a kind of work. You can still believe in the same fundamental idea that work, action, creates value, but trade is an action.
Right, but then if you invest in the idea of the LTV, for example, right, that immediately implies that all profit is theft. Right? You see how this falls.
Well, only if you make it a moral argument. You can just accept that the LTV is what's happening, but if you don't add morality to it, then it's just a description of fact. It's not exploitation. It's just that's what happens.
Oh yeah, well, theft is a crime, right? Like you can just use like laws and say, oh yeah, this is a crime, so we must recompensate ourselves if you want.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, I could create a moral argument for this, but I'm not inclined right now. Maybe some other time. But yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, sure. If you want to go the moral just completely like, oh yeah, no no ought statements anymore. Yeah, sure. Labor theory of value is real, and your labor is being stolen. But what should you do about it?
Well, it's not.
I can't really
I don't
say
think
anything.
it's stolen, because I think that the you're being paid for your work, and the profit that's taken over is what the value is, the risk value. So that extra profit that's made that goes to the capitalist.
Right. So this goes back to the question I asked you a long time ago, which was, what is the threshold for investment? At which point, like when you invest, let's say I invest $1, and I immediately said, okay, well, you implied that there's no threshold. So I said you can invest like literally 0.00001 cents and make like billions of dollars off of that.
I think that
would be permitted under you.
I think that I'm not permitting something like that. What I'm saying is that the capitalist would pay the worker so that they could live comfortably, which means it doesn't mean that I'm going to just starve them out and kill them. That goes against the interests of the company. It's important for that worker to have a good, happy life and live so that they can buy things, because they are the people I'm selling my product to. So it's in my best interest to give the worker a living wage. The threshold then really is a negotiation that happens.
Then why didn't it happen in the Gilded Age?
I don't know. You'd have to go ask them. It's not an argument against capitalism just because there are times where capitalism does bad stuff, and there hasn't been an alternative offered yet. We're still debating on what type of capitalism is best. We haven't really gotten into an alternative that would be better and why we should go to that alternative. So I think at this point, the capitalist team is still, we've been talking for 50 minutes and we still haven't gone through an alternative to replace capitalism.
Vanessa, do you want to speak? I think Vanessa is pro-socialism. Not sure though.
No, I'm just
think
listening.
devil's advocate Arco turned me into cap.
Again, I'm just, all right, sure, let's debate this alternative. Now the workers fully own the company, right? So there's no one accruing wealth at the top, right? There's no profit. Well, all profit is either distributed to maintaining the upkeep of a factory or a general workplace. And the rest of it, the rest of the surplus value will go to the workers, right? So yes, they are losing surplus value, but just because you have to maintain the workplace, there's no person accruing surplus value at the top, right? And I would say that's the main characteristic of capitalism. If you want to call that capitalism, then yeah, sure, I'm advocating for capitalism, but it's a capitalism where you can't make profits.
Well, that's an interesting idea. So what you're saying is that you collectivize the profit, and then from the collectivized profit, you can then try and make it more equitable. Is that what you're suggesting? Interesting.
Sure, if you want to call socialism capitalism without profits, then I'll secede the win right away. I mean, I'm just against profit, and I think the word to describe the kind of system that I'm describing is socialism. If you want to move capitalism to encompass
of a profit.
My definition of profit.
Yeah.
It's just the revenue minus the cost of the material. That's the profit. And then obviously, all right, you have to factor in, the wage labor and stuff, which is complicated.
That's the cost.
Yeah, it's the revenue minus the cost. That's profit.
Yeah, but let's suppose you're producing. You don't have money. You have only goods you can trade. Like you don't have paper money, for the example's sake. Yeah. So imagine this. It's a situation that you like, and you wanna create a table of value so you can know if you're producing more than you were burning, or vice versa. So how do you determine that?
Right. So can you rehash that? You have all right. So you have
you don't have money. Like you don't have common currency. It doesn't have to be paper money. You don't have common currency. It's forbidden, let's say, by law. And you're producing something, and you're taking other things to produce this. How do you know if you're producing more than what you're costing?
Well, Okay. So you're saying how do you? All right, I understand now. You're saying how do you justify the assumption that value is created in labor? Like that's the only way I can interpret that question.
Yeah. Let's say this. I have a factory that costs me 10 hours per worker, and I don't necessarily sell the product. I just know that I produce a certain amount of product, and I'm costing these workers 10 hours a day, and I have like 10 workers, which is 100 hours a day. And I'm also consuming certain materials like steel or plastic, and I'm producing something with all this, and I want to make sure that I'm producing more than I'm consuming. Do you understand?
Yeah. I understand. I think we can make it even simpler than that. We can say, all right, let's say an intelligent agent is sitting with a pile of steel on one hand, and they can feed it through themselves, right? Like they're like a cybernetic organism or something. You can feed it through themselves, and out pops a product made out of the steel. Yeah. That is not simply the raw material. How do you know that value has been produced in that situation? That's the question you're asking.
Yeah.
Well, then I would say, would you, like, this is simply the difference between like building a house versus just giving a person a bunch of like logs, right? This goes back to my original contention. Like, if this were true, right? Like, if you really, for example, if it were actually contentious that you were producing value when you worked on things, right? My analogy with like, going from, blowing glass to creating a supercomputer, the supercomputer is just as valuable as like a porcelain vase. So I don't understand, like, yeah, value is created. I don't know how to explain it other than with that example.
It is created. I'm sure it is created from a certain reference point. Well, all I'm trying to do is figure out if I can measure it, if I can put a number to it. Let's say I'm a central without currency.
Well, you want to put a number to it, but you want to put a number to it without currency. Like if I asked you how much is your car worth, and you can't use like money, I would be lost.
Just
like,
a
I think
scale.
Any economist.
Just a scale. I have a scale at home, and I measure my weight. I don't need money for that. Like,
well,
what
you're
is
just measuring it. Well, then I can drive my car 60 miles down the road, right, and say it's worth 60, and then I can drive it down 30, and now all of a sudden it's worth 30. You're just measuring something intrinsic to the thing. You're not measuring value.
Yeah, that's a problem, because I'm producing something that's not necessarily something I'm going to consume myself. So, for example, I'm consuming a lot of products to produce a house, and I'm not going to consume the house myself. So how do I know, even though I consume more products for building the house, how do I know the future owner is going to like the house?
Well, here's the thing. What you're creating has some use value, right? And that use value is something that's desirable, right? I'm not against the idea of the fundamental idea of like supply and demand. Obviously, supply and demand will determine markets, no matter like if you're in a socialist or capitalist, economy. Yes, the market will determine the price, right?
Okay.
And the price will be contingent upon its use value. Yes, I agree.
So we start by supply and demand. Okay, that's good. One of the reasons the Soviet Union crashed in the view of the Austrian School of Economics is that Soviet Union didn't have a price table. So what they could do is they could basically go to the US and look at their prices and then assume that the same supply and demand was going to be occurring in their country. And of course, it wasn't the case. So
there are 5 more minutes.
So there would be cases where they would super produce a certain thing and they would be lacking in something else. Or is there a solution for that?
Oh, just planning an economy? Like logistically?
Yeah. Are you a central planner anarchist or decentralized anarchist?
I'm not actually sure, but I'm like All right, yeah, sure. You can argue that, the Soviet Union didn't have like good enough data, like measuring statistics to accurately gauge, what a product is worth, and they couldn't actually do it in real time, right? Unlike is inherently built into a capitalist system. I will agree that is an inherent advantage of a capitalist system, that this kind of supply and demand is built into the system, right? That's an advantage, right? But I would say we can do it a lot better today and tomorrow, like like metaphorically tomorrow. We could do it even better, right? Like data gauging techniques or data gathering techniques are just getting better and better throughout time. So, I mean, this is just a technological question. This is a question of logistics, and therefore it's a technological question. And technology will eventually solve it, right?
Like technology is going to solve subjective value.
No, I thought we were talking about supply and demand.
Yeah, supply and demand is determined by subjective value.
I actually got to mention something on that note. If technology can solve subjective value, because, well, I work for a company that makes a certain product, and it's for vehicles and to gather data for the vehicles, right? And some of the metrics are not actually measurable. Like happiness, for example, of the drivers that are more safe because they're using the product, or the people that are saved from the product because, like, if we implement something like seatbelt monitoring for the product, and that causes less accidents, for example, that's a subjective measurement that you can't really put a number on it. Like the number of people in the world that aren't dying because of the use of the product. So, like, going back to the value of some things you can actually measure, like fuel efficiency. I'm still talking about my company, like that I work for. Like fuel efficiency, for example, it may not be a major big deal right now because fuel prices are low, but there's certain aspects to a product that you can measure, and certain aspects to a product that bring value but you can't measure. So that's just like a little piece of something I wanted to add.
Yeah,
right. Absolutely. I agree 100%. And for your example, I would say, yes, the value of that product is indeed, it's hard to determine. You can't look at it, right? And I think this is a capitalistic idea, not a socialistic idea. The idea that you can look at something, like, and this is present in investment, right? The idea that you can look at, a piece of intellectual property, right? Or you can look at a product and immediately deem what it's worth in dollars or in equivalent form of currency. I don't think that's very useful, or I don't think that's possible, rather, right? I think that, the technology that we'll have, maybe 100 years from now, will have kind of uses that are like, just, that we can't even dream of today. So we're going to create value just by, creating new ideas in that sense, right?
Why doesn't price equal value? Like how much someone's willing to pay for something, why doesn't that just equal the value? Why are we talking about?
Well, that's the idea of supply and demand.
You could offer way more than a product is worth.
All right. If you want to go, Arco, you're saying something, right?
I was just going to ask a question, but do you want to do the closing statements, Leopold?
I'd rather just answer questions by UTS instead of just saying something.
Well, I'll just make one statement, and then you guys can answer some questions. I don't think that there's been an alternative offer other than something that is just like a form of capitalism that's maybe better in some ways, but at the end of the day, there hasn't been an alternative presented that is better than capitalism. So I think that we should just, try to make the best with what we have, and capitalism is the way.
Is that all for the closing statement?
Yep.
Yeah, you can ask. You guys can do questions about it.
No questions.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I would say, yeah, sure. We didn't spend that much time debating a new economic system that is an alternative to capitalism, but I think I've done at least a decent job in trying to show where the failings of capitalism are. Right? My objective here was not necessarily, I know this was kind of going outside of the debate parameters, but yes, what we did more in this debate was try and show that there is a necessity for a need to for an alternative to capitalism, and I believe that this is the battleground on which new socialist capitalists will be created primarily, and we can talk about alternatives later. I still think that the example brought up at the end, where this idea of socialism is just what you might say is capitalism without profit, for example. Although, again, I disagree with the notion that capitalism is just, the exchange of goods, because then basically everything is capitalism. Like if you're under a communist government or a communist economic system, and you trade, for example, a plate for a bowl, that now becomes capitalism. Although I might be missing the point on the definition. Although that's kind of what I interpreted from what Leopold said at the beginning. But yeah, I think that it is more important, at least politically, to show the failings of capitalism rather than discuss alternatives. And even on the alternative side, I think that we brought up a good example, which is just what you might call capitalism without profit. That's basically all I have to say.
Oh, snap!
Yeah, get 2 philosopher Prince rolls.
That's sick. I didn't realize I was interrupting the live debate. Like I knew you guys were debating, but I didn't realize.
Well, what's really funny is I was on the socialist side to start, and then someone left, and I flipped to.
Well, yeah, I got confused with that.
You're now hard on capitalists.
Well, I mean, all of the things I was bringing up are things that were hard for me to try to find answers to in my preparation.
Good job.
Yeah, true.
Wait, so
true. I did struggle.
Can we continue the conversation in some Weezy if you guys want?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. I'll move to debate.
All right.
Nice job, Leopold. Nice job,
Why?
UD. Huh?
Okay.
Yeah, in the
like,
debate.
why?
I thought you guys both did a great job.
That was really good. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Well, thanks.
I mean, it's not topics that I'm familiar with, so I can't.
Hello.